Hey everyone, welcome to this course on the CIS controls. Now I want to stress this course is just going to give you a broad overview of at the time of filming, of the 18 CIS controls that are in place. And as CIS comes out with additional controls in the future or removes some from the list like they did in this past version of the controls, we'll go ahead and update the course with any additional controls or with what's been removed. So what are we going to cover in this course? We're going to cover, like I said, these top 18 controls. And I'm not going to read through that. You can read through that list yourself, but we'll cover each one of those on an individual basis. We'll talk about the control, give you a little context around it, as well as some of the safeguards that are recommended by CIS for the different controls. And so the front 9, as I like to call them, or the first half of the controls we're going to cover are 1 through 9. And that's just going to be inventory and control of enterprise assets, software assets, data protection, the secure configuration of your assets, so assets and the software, account management, access control management, so things like the principle of least privilege. We'll touch on that a little bit. Continuous vulnerability management, so your vulnerability stuff, auditing, as well as email and web browser protection. So without further ado, let's jump right into the first 9 controls. So the first CIS control is the inventory and control of enterprise assets. So basically, attackers are continuously scanning organizations, trying to identify vulnerable assets that are attached to the enterprise's network. Identifying those assets and assessing them for vulnerabilities can help these organizations better protect their critical data and services. Enterprises really should know what data is deemed critical and which enterprise assets hold or manage that critical data. So that way they can then implement appropriate security controls, for example, network segmentation or even application segmentation. Now, proper segmentation is also important when it comes to auditing. For example, if you have an organization that manages patient data, so healthcare data, and also processes credit card transactions, you want those systems that are being managed and storing that different types of data to be segmented. If they're not, lacking the proper segmentation can lead to, during an audit, those different systems all being included in an audit. So you really want to make sure that you're segmenting out different systems that are handling different types of data. And the only way you can do that is to really understand what kind of assets you have across the organization. If you're out of compliance, so if they come and they assess and they start assessing all these systems because you're not segmenting your network, you have a flat network as we call it, then it can lead to potentially you being out of compliance as well as receiving fines. It may not sound like such a big deal, but when you think about something like NERC, which is the Energy Industry Standard, those fines can reach $1 million per incident per day, which quickly adds up. Enterprise assets can also include systems that are used for sales demonstrations. So if you have demonstration environments to show your product or service being used, different test systems. So if you have a test network or test environment, as well as guest networks. All of these should be identified and again, properly segmented to help protect against additional compromise and what we call lateral movement. Asset inventory, it's very dynamic in today's world. So you got portable end user devices that connect and disconnect from the network very quickly. We have our whole bring your own device aspect. We have cloud environments and virtual machines. And in the cloud, we have virtual machines that we can spin up and down quickly. And so it makes it very difficult these days to maintain that proper inventory of enterprise assets. Now, another area where it's important to have this inventory of the enterprise assets is when we're talking about incident response. So when you're conducting an investigation, you're trying to determine where was this network traffic originating from, whether it's malicious or just suspicious, and then also trying to identify what assets are affected as part of this incident. This is where the asset management becomes so critical in effective incident response. So a key takeaway here when you think about control number 1 is you really just cannot defend what you don't know that you have. There's no way, if you don't know you have a door on your house or a window on your house, there's no way to put protection on that because you don't know it exists. Some of the safeguards when we're talking about this first control here is you want to make sure that you establish and maintain the detailed enterprise asset inventory. Again, this can mean so many things, right? There's a lot of different assets across an organization, and there's many tools that can be used to try to gain a little bit of control over your assets. One being MDM, or mobile device management. It allows you to manage those mobile end user devices, specifically those that are issued by corporate. So things like your laptops, your tablets, your mobile phones that people have. So being able to manage the security for those devices and manage the inventory on those. Also addressing unauthorized assets is another safeguard for control number 1 here. So make sure that you actually have a process across your organization to address, hey, if we identify something that seems like an unauthorized asset, what are we doing? And really, at a minimum, you should be looking for this stuff on a weekly basis. A lot of tools will allow it to be more automated. Using an active discovery tool. So again, constantly scanning your network to try to identify what's here, what belongs, what doesn't belong. And it can be difficult if you come into a smaller organization and you're trying to get inventory and nobody actually did this prior to you coming in. So it can be a little bit challenging to go ahead and do that. And then using DHCP logging on all of your DHCP servers. So assuming you know what DHCP is, but if not, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. And so basically using this to help you update the enterprise's asset inventory and reviewing those DHCP logs. And then finally, using a passive asset discovery tool. So again, we've got active scanning, we've got more passive scanning. A lot of these are built into native security tools these days. So a lot of this is natively built into these different security tools. So when you go out to an enterprise, there's likely something or some things that they're using to actually try to get a handle on their assets. Keep in mind that it's never going to be 100%. There's always some kind of rogue device that you may find. There's all sorts of shadow devices people love to plug in to your corporate network to try to do their jobs or make their jobs easier. The second CIS control is inventory and control of software assets. So threat actors are continuously scanning organizations to try to identify vulnerabilities in the versions of software or the types of software that are being used. Attackers can then take those vulnerabilities, leverage them to attack the organization and also to maintain access to different systems across that organization. And in doing so, they can then leverage those systems that are compromised to conduct lateral movement attacks and eventually get to whatever their ultimate goal is. In a lot of cases, one of their ultimate goals is to go hit the Active Directory domain controllers. By leveraging a proper patch management program, organizations can help to reduce their attack surface quite a bit. Now, there are some attackers out there that will leverage zero-day exploits, especially some of your more advanced threat actor groups out there, many of your APT groups. And so those basically, a zero-day exploit takes advantage of previously unknown or undisclosed vulnerabilities in applications. By completing this inventory of software assets, the organization can actually work to identify potential areas of vulnerability where they may say, well, this particular application has a history of 0 days, so we probably need to implement additional security controls to help mitigate the impact of a 0-day attack. As an example, let's say that I was a bad guy and I was trying to attack your organization and I wanted to get somebody in your finance department to wire me some money. So I do a phishing attack and I contact them maybe via email or a phone call and I say, hey, it's Sally and I need you to wire me some money. It's urgent. It's a CEO. I'm Sally and you got to send this money. You got to pay this invoice. Send the money. I know it's a new bank account, but send this money right away. If as an organization I have 0 additional security controls in place, somebody may actually wire me that money. In fact, it happens in a lot of cases. We call it business email compromise when it leads to that financial loss. Now, if I, as an organization, put an additional security control in place where maybe somebody has to call someone else and there has to be 2 people approving any wire transfer, that could actually really reduce the likelihood of a successful attack. In fact, without going into too many details, understand that in a lot of critical infrastructure areas, especially very sensitive areas, there's a human control element where somebody has to do something or there's a delay in time before some action can be taken, which really helps reduce the likelihood of a successful attack. Another reason for maintaining a proper inventory of software assets is to really help identify any unnecessary applications that are on systems. So for anyone that's ever downloaded Windows, you know it comes with a lot of what we call bloatware, a lot of applications you're never going to use. And those are all a security risk, especially if you don't keep them updated. So what organizations need to do, and even you listening to this on your personal computers, you need to identify what are the applications you're not using and see if it's if you're able to uninstall those, because it really helps you reduce the attack surface area on your system. And for an organization with tens of thousands of systems, there's a lot of attack surface. So if we can remove a lot of these bloatware applications, then we can really help reduce security risk across the organization. So a key takeaway here for the second control is to really understand that you cannot protect an enterprise system or application if you don't know what's on it. Many organizations have, again, what we call the bloatware. That they're not using it for any type of business operation. It's just on there. It just came natively. It's a default install. But those bloatware applications introduce that unnecessary risk to critical systems. So again, something to keep in mind there, even on your own personal systems at home, that you probably have some applications you can remove. Even on your cell phone, you have applications you can remove that will really help reduce your attack surface. So when we talk about safeguards for control number 2, we are talking about things like establishing and maintaining a software inventory. So again, this is not just saying, okay, we have Windows installed on this machine. It's actually, let's take an inventory of what software we have licensed, any open source software we're using. You need to identify things like, when was this installed? When was it last used? Why do we actually need this, right? So what's that business purpose for this particular software? What version are we on? How are we deploying this? Like, how do we roll this out to everybody? Or is it a one-off thing that we have to install on certain departments? For example, let's say in accounting, is there a certain software accounting uses where we have a gold image with just that on it? What's the frequency of this? Are we having to update it annually, monthly, semi-annually? Have we never updated it? These are all things that we need to make sure you document. Ensuring authorized software is currently supported. So making sure that software that's currently supported by your organization and your IT and your security teams, that's what's designated as authorized, and anything else, you identify what's the actual reason we need this, and if you don't need it, how can we remove this? And what impact does it have on other systems or other applications if we remove this? Because you do find, especially like in healthcare, that there are systems that are reliant upon legacy systems or legacy applications. And so you have to be very careful about just unplugging different applications or across your organization. Address unauthorized software. So that's another safeguard for this control. So again, if this is not authorized software, why is it on there, right? What are we doing? How are we monitoring our end users to make sure that they're not installing TikTok or something on our systems just because they want to listen to it? So keeping in mind that we need a way, and there's a lot of tools out there we can use, but we need a way to be able to track that unauthorized software. Another safeguard is utilizing automated software inventory tools. Again, this really helps you. It's unrealistic at an enterprise level for you to go manually into each system. Creating a allow list for authorized software libraries, authorized scripts. So again, making sure that you're getting software from the right locations, from the actual vendor, and not from some cheap website that says, hey, get the latest version here. Making sure that your end users, if they're installing things, that they're getting it from the company's intranet, and that intranet page is secured as best as possible so they know they're getting a good version of whatever the software is. And then something that we generally call detection engineering, where we're talking about the allow list of authorized scripts. So for example, if I'm Larry in accounting and I never run PowerShell scripts on my system, but all of a sudden a PowerShell script tries to run, if we build proper detection engineering, then that's going to be detected that, hey, Larry's trying to run a PowerShell script, and that's going to be indicative of maybe an attack. So we immediately will automate isolation of Larry's system. We'll immediately flag it. We'll send that alert to somebody on the IR team or whomever we're having responsible, but usually someone on the IR team. They'll get the alert, and then we'll say, hey, let's take a closer look at Larry's machine. Now, maybe it's legit. Maybe Larry wrote a script. He learned some PowerShell over the weekend, and he wrote himself a little script to help with his job. Maybe it's legit. Very unlikely in that situation, though, right? If Larry's never run a PowerShell script before, then it's possible that his system is compromised. And then also, again, with the allow list, making sure that whatever scripts we've created as an organization that we authorize, those are allowed, and then we can block anything else from executing. CIS control number 3 is data protection. So these days, an organization's data, it's not contained in a single location. So it's not just on the enterprise network. Data is stored in a variety of places. It's accessed in a variety of places. Places like cloud environments, mobile devices, even users accessing the data from home, as we'd seen during pandemics. And then also data is shared and stored with third parties. And so they may actually store or access that data from literally anywhere in the world. And a lot of that storage and access for third parties is going to depend upon the SLAs or service level agreements you have with them. So with data stored in cloud environments, there could be numerous international regulations that actually pertain for your organization to that data. So you have to maintain compliance with different things. For example, one of those being GDPR. Now, this is why data must be managed appropriately throughout its entire life cycle. When the attackers gain initial access to an organization, one of their typical objectives is to find and exfiltrate sensitive data. And that can include a variety of things. It could include financial data, customer data, things like intellectual property, and much, much more. By using encryption, organizations can help protect the data even in the event it's stolen by attackers. In fact, using data encryption both at rest and in transit can be required by many industry regulations. It's important for enterprises to develop an effective data management process that includes a data management framework, guidelines for classifying the data and prioritizing it, requirements for data protection, and also requirements for handling the data, retention of the data, so how long are we keeping this data, and then also when we want to dispose of the data, what's that proper disposal process that we do. Once organizations properly classify and prioritize the data, they then need to map which assets that data lives on and then segment those assets with different data sensitivity levels. And this can be accomplished with different tools like firewalls. The organization should also have a process for managing data breaches that plugs into their incident response plan, their compliance plans, as well as their corporate communication plans. So some key takeaways for this third control here around data protection. Data must be managed appropriately throughout its entire life cycle. So again, there's numerous regulations out there, especially depending upon where your organization is storing and accessing this data that are going to apply. So there needs to be an entire life cycle management in place. And this is exactly why protecting the data is so critical. It can cost the organization a lot of money in fines or other financial penalties, including litigation. And data that's encrypted, both in transit and at rest, can actually help protect against that data compromise. So safeguards for control number 3, which is data protection, can include things like establishing and maintaining that data management process. Again, we talked about that. Identifying what's the sensitivity of this data, how are we classifying this, who's the data owner, how are we handling the data, what are the retention limits, so how long are we keeping that data around, what are our requirements for disposing of that data. So again, this can be internal for the organization, so they can determine we need to store it for this long, but also regulatory standards are in place. So for example, with HIPAA and other healthcare regulations, you may have to store patient data for a certain period of time. In fact, it's usually around 7 years. Another safeguard is establishing and maintaining that data inventory. So again, you can't protect anything that you don't know you have. So really identifying what is the data we deem critical for as an organization, what is that most sensitive data, where is that being stored at, and then again, this is a continuous process, right? We don't just say, oh, data, it's sensitive, we're good to go. Because as an organization, things are changing all the time. So at least annually, at a minimum, the organization needs to go back, look at the data they have, reprioritize the information and say, okay, this is the new sensitive data, or we're going to continue on these things that have been sensitive last year. These are the same things we're going to be protecting this year. Another safeguard is configuring data access control lists. So making sure that the right people or the right systems or applications can access the right data without anyone unauthorized accessing it. So this can include things like file systems, making sure databases are secured, as well as applications themselves. Enforcing data retention. So again, this may be required by certain regulations of a certain period of time. You have to keep that data. It could also be an internal thing of an organization saying, okay, to save cost, we're only going to store this data for X period of time. Another safeguard is proper disposal of that data, so securely disposing of data. So again, how are we disposing of the data? If it's classified information, we work for a government agency, there's a certain process. If it's just generic Google search information that we happen to be storing as an enterprise, there's likely another process for that, right? It's not going to be the same as a classified system. So making sure that we properly dispose of that data. Implementing encryption on end user devices. So Things like Windows come with BitLocker by default. You've got Apple's File Vault and some others like dmcrypt over on Linux. So basically just leveraging what's internal, what's native for those operating systems or those systems, and then also adding to that if need be. So as an example, if you were a nurse or you worked in healthcare in security and you dealt with nurses, which I did, sometimes they lose a laptop or they have a laptop stolen out of their truck or trunk. And so if the data is not encrypted, then someone may potentially get access to that device, get the information on there, the patient information on there, and then be able to leverage that for identity theft or any number of things, extortion, etc. But if we encrypt that data, if we leverage some of the native tools, for example, BitLocker, then if that device is stolen and the person that steals it or the individuals that steal it don't have the password or anything or code to unlock it, then it's very unlikely that they'll be able to access that sensitive information. Another safeguard is establishing and maintaining that data classification scheme. Again, just making sure that we are appropriately as an organization classifying that data properly. Document data flows. So we want to make sure that we understand as an organization, where is this data going? How is this flowing throughout our systems, our networks, applications? What does this look like? We need to really map that out so we can identify any additional areas of vulnerability that we need to put additional security controls in place on. Another safeguard, encrypting data on removable media as well as encrypting sensitive data in transit. So making sure that we encrypt any removable media, so for example, a USB stick, making sure that that's encrypted and protected so I can't just pick it up from you and go plug it in and get all the sensitive information. Encrypting that sensitive data in transit, so again, this can be used in things like TLS or OpenSSH. Encrypting the sensitive data at rest, so again on servers or databases, even in applications themselves, making sure that we're encrypting that at rest so if someone does attack those systems, we are protecting that data, or at least reducing the risk of them being able to have meaningful impact with that data. Segmenting our data processing and storage based on sensitivity. So for example, not processing sensitive data on enterprise assets that are intended for just that lower level of sensitivity. So making sure that, again, we go back and segment out what's sensitive, what isn't quite as sensitive, and keeping those completely siloed away from each other if possible. Deploying a data loss prevention solution. So these are very, very helpful to identify if sensitive data is being exfiltrated, unless you're dealing with something like an APT group where they may be exfiltrating small amounts so they don't trigger your DLP solution. But for the average end user that might be stealing, let's just say healthcare information, these are good solutions to capture things like that. And then also logging sensitive data access. So who's accessing the sensitive data on these systems, when they're accessing it, who's modifying things, is someone disposing of it, so is someone deleting data, or are they following a process to do our process to do so? So really just logging that information, that what's happening with the data, so then we can identify, is there something going on that's malicious, or is there an accidental deletion, and there's something else we need to put in place as far as security controls to protect against this issue in the future, as well as, is somebody internally just malicious, right? Do we have an insider threat that's attacking our data and trying to steal it or trying to destroy it? Control number 4 is a secure configuration of enterprise assets and software. So many assets and software applications are going to ship with default configurations, and the focus from the manufacturer is usually ease of deployment and ease of use, and really not a focus on security whatsoever. This means that you're going to have default login credentials, so sometimes the password is admin and the username is admin. Sometimes default credentials are used, sometimes default services and ports are open on the device or even on the application. Sometimes it'll come with pre-configured DNS settings. It'll come with vulnerable protocols that are in use, so outdated protocols or just vulnerable protocols. It also may come with some extra pre-installed software. So we talked in a previous video a little bit about what's called bloatware. So basically we use Microsoft Windows as an example, where you get a lot of extra things on Microsoft Windows that you don't necessarily need. So all these things come kind of out of the box with these different enterprise assets or software. And what this all does is this actually increases the attack surface area for the asset or the application. Organizations really need to use proper configuration management to ensure that the assets or applications are configured for security, that the security configurations they put in place are continuously assessed and adjusted to improve, and then also that the configuration process is properly documented and can be reviewed for compliance It can be reviewed during audits and also during incident response. In cloud environments, there's a model called the shared responsibility model. This helps organizations see what areas of the stack they need to manage security and what falls upon the cloud security provider. So as an example, in platform as a service, or PaaS as we call it, the cloud service provider will typically manage the operating system itself, but the patching and updating of any hosted applications, that's going to fall upon the enterprise or the client. Now, there's many configuration management tools out there that can help organizations compare their configurations against industry standards and regulations. And one of those tools is the CIS Configuration Assessment Tool, or CIS CAT. So the key takeaways for control number 4 is just really keeping in mind that many enterprise assets and applications come off the shelf or out of the box with default credentials, default configurations, including exposing to vulnerabilities, as well as the bloatware that we talked about, where that all these combined really just introduce an additional attack surface area and increase the risk for these organizations. That's why it's so critical for organizations to implement proper configuration management across the organization. Safeguards for control number 4 include establishing and maintaining that secure configuration process. So again, how are we managing our end user devices, portable, mobile devices? How are we handling any IoT devices, servers? How are we managing the software, so the operating systems, applications? How are we reviewing and updating our documentation? So all that falls under that configuration process. Another safeguard is establishing and maintaining a secure configuration process just for our network infrastructure, so kind of focusing in on that. So again, establishing and maintaining a secure configuration process for things like our network devices. Again, looking at the documentation, make sure that's updated at least annually. And then if there's any significant enterprise changes that are occurring that could impact our network security, we revamp and reassess this area to identify, are we actually still relatively secure on our network infrastructure, or do we have changes that we need to make? Another safeguard is configure automatic session locking on enterprise assets. So you might have seen this on your workstation where you leave, you run to the restroom or something, it automatically locks after a certain period of time. Implementing and managing a firewall on servers, and then also implementing and managing firewalls on end user devices. So again, using those host firewalls that are available to provide an additional layer of protection using virtual firewalls, etc. Securely managing enterprise assets and software. So this is basically around configuration management, right? So for example, using things like SSH, forcing things like HTTPS for your web traffic, your browser traffic, as opposed to just HTTP. Not using insecure management protocols, so making sure you're not using like Telnet, for example, unless it's absolutely critical to operations, which in a lot of cases it's not going to be. Another safeguard is managing default accounts on enterprise assets and software. So account credential issues are one of the big issues out there. So as an example, usually if someone leaves an organization, if there's not a good process in place, those credentials are out there, and it's not much for an attacker to get those and leverage those to use for their attack. So for example, when we think about default accounts on these assets and software when they come in, root accounts, any type of admin accounts, any type of pre-configured vendor account. So maybe they have a third party that helped with development of this asset or installing certain software, and they left that account open. So going through and actually disabling all those accounts and making them unusable, those actually help reduce that attack surface area on the device. Another safeguard, uninstalling or disabling unnecessary services. So again, if we don't need like file sharing, for example, if we don't need to be able to share files on the device, then let's disable that. If we don't need the device to touch the web at all, let's disable that ability, right? Or there's certain services that are not needed, let's disable those. The more we can disable and remove, the better we are on reducing that attack surface area. Configure trusted DNS servers on the enterprise assets, and then another safeguard is also enforcing automatic device lockout on the end user devices. So again, if you've got a mobile phone that's issued by your company and someone's trying to unlock it, maybe it locks it out after 10 or 20 attempts. And from there, that requires the individual to actually have to contact the IT team and prove who they are before that device is unlocked. Another safeguard is enforcing remote wipe capability on those end user devices. So being able to, if the device is stolen or if the individual no longer is part of the enterprise, even before you get the device back, being able to remotely wipe off any data from that so it's just back to the initial configurations. And then finally, separating enterprise workspaces on mobile devices. So this is a big one also when we think about bring your own device. So if I've got my own device, but I'm installing corporate apps on there and using those, how is that being managed and segmented out where if I want to check, Facebook, for example, or TikTok or something, that's not having a significant impact on those corporate apps that might be on my device. CIS control number 5 is account management. So organizations need to use processes and tools to assign and manage the authorization to credentials for their user accounts. So this includes things like your traditional user accounts, your administrator accounts, service accounts for enterprise assets, and also software applications. Now, many attackers actually leverage weak and default user credentials. They leverage old test accounts. They leverage old user accounts of people who have left the organization. They also leverage service accounts as well as shared accounts. If you give access to a third party for maybe a certain fix or to have their support team help out with something that you're implementing, a lot of times those accounts are forgotten about, and so attackers will find these and leverage those as part of their attack. If a user is using the same password across multiple accounts, so as an example, some people use the same password for their social media accounts, their bank account, and then also it's the same password as their corporate account, so their corporate login. Attackers can leverage that. So let's say they compromise your TikTok account and they get your password from there. They basically get the information from a data breach. So now they've got your password. They do what's called credential stuffing. And what that means is they just basically, as the name implies, they just stuff your credentials. And they stuff it into all your accounts to try to see if the password they've gotten for you in that data breach actually works. And if you're using the same password across all these different accounts, then they're more likely to be successful with this type of attack. Privileged accounts, so things like administrator accounts, service accounts, etc. These types of accounts that have a lot of access, these are one of the most common targets by attackers. And a lot of times they'll also use social engineering. If they identify someone that may have really good access in the organization, they'll try to socially engineer them into compromising their account. Because this allows the attacker to not only get the privileges of that user account and hit different systems, it also allows them to usually create new user accounts. So that way, if let's say you change a password on an account they get, that's an admin account, if they create some new user accounts that you don't notice, they can maintain persistence, because even though you changed the password and you secured that administrator account, they've created other administrators with different names and you didn't notice that, so now they're able to maintain access across your organization. Now, organizations themselves really should be auditing user and service accounts periodically. And this is really to ensure that active accounts, so any accounts you're finding, can actually be traced back to an authorized user. And in particular, those privileged accounts where you kind of got the keys to the kingdom in a lot of cases, those should be monitored closely, especially if there's a previous audit and there's new accounts, new admin accounts, or new privileged accounts created since that last account audit. You really need to dig into those and take a look at those. Now, these days, many organizations have implemented what's called single sign-on. So essentially, you just log into one account and that authenticates you across all these different systems. There's a number of providers out there that offer this, including places like Okta. But for any organizations that are still using multiple passwords, and in some cases you can't get away from that just because it's a more legacy application. So if you're using multiple passwords, implementing things like password managers can help make it easier on your end users, and also implementing multi-factor authentication can really help, especially in the case of a credential stuffing attack, can really help be that next step of prevention to block the attack. Multi-factor authentication, or MFA, should also be used for any remote access that you're doing. So if I'm an end user, I'm trying to access some system or application remotely, you should be requiring me to implement multi-factor authentication to really prove that it's me. And if someone is using a system or an application, and we talked about this before, if they're using that, but there's a period of inactivity, as an organization, you really should be logging those individuals out. So a key takeaway of this fifth control here is to understand that it's relatively rare for attackers to quote unquote hack into a user account. So they get your complex password and they sit there with the ones and zeros on their keyboard with the neon lights in their mom's basement. It's pretty rare for them to do that, right? Most attackers are pretty lazy. Even nation state level attackers, they want the path of least resistance, right? So not necessarily lazy, but path of least resistance. So it's a lot of work to just try to crack your password. Why would I do all that work when I can take a password I have from you from a data breach and just try it against all the accounts I can find for you to see if that password is valid? And if you're using the same password, again, as we talked about a moment ago, it's probably likely that I'm going to be successful as the attacker and I'll get in and then I can cause chaos from there. So again, just keep in mind, it's much easier for an attacker to just compromise weak credentials, default credentials, or to exploit some type of user account like that we've forgotten about, like a service account, for example, than it is for them to actually, quote unquote, hack into your user account. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's relatively rare. There's a lot of other paths that are much less resistance for them to go down. Another key takeaway is organizations really should be implementing auditing of accounts and proper access management. And this is for joiners, so people that are joining the organization, making sure they're getting the correct access and not giving you're not giving them the keys to the kingdom. Movers, so people that are moving across different organizational business units. And then leavers, so people that have left the organization and having a process in place where we're actually removing those user accounts. Some of the safeguards for control number 5 are establishing and maintaining that inventory of accounts. Again, if you don't know what you have, how can you ever protect it? So there's a number of tools you can use out there. A lot of organizations use things like Active Directory to do some of the management. So just really taking an inventory of those user accounts and then those privileged accounts, right? So the administrator accounts, the service accounts, etc. And really the inventory needs to identify if it's a human's account. So what's the person's name? What's the username? When was this created? When should this account be expired? So if we know that someone's leaving the organization, when's their last day? When are we going to actually terminate their access? And then continuously monitoring these accounts to make sure that these are still legit, that we still need to keep these accounts in place. Another safeguard is using unique passwords. So again, if your organization is still using passwords, making sure that you've got unique passwords for all of these different accounts that you might be using. Minimum 8-character. That's according to the CIS control recommendation. You can, of course, do longer. Preferably a passphrase and not like a password, something complex. And then making sure you implement multi-factor authentication on there, right? So it's not enough to just have a password because even those can be cracked, or if you're using the same password across the board, those are pretty easy to identify and do credential stuffing and get access. So another safeguard is disabling dormant accounts. Again, someone's leaving the company, or if a service account is no longer needed, let's go ahead and delete those or disable those. That way they cannot be leveraged later by an attacker. Another safeguard, restricting administrator privileges to dedicated administrator accounts. What does that even mean? Well, if I have administrator duties to perform, I'm not likely going to be doing those every day, right? Or maybe I will, but maybe I don't need to have that account be tied to all of my other access. So what that means basically is I should have, as an administrator, I should have a couple accounts. I should have one that I do for like my normal daily things I have to do. And then I should have a separate set of credentials that is maybe for a critical system that I only use. And maybe I have to have a second person put their credentials in at the same time or something. A good example of that is for Active Directory. We might use what's called a jump server, where to access the domain controller, we have a separate server that's hardened, that's isolated, that we log into. And then from there, we can then log into our domain controller. So that's basically a jump server, right? And people have different names for them, but jump server is one that I've used and many people typically use. So those credentials would be different than my day-to-day credentials as an admin. So I don't need to go into that jump server every day necessarily, or if I do, I just need to go in with certain credentials. I don't need to use my regular corporate credentials because for the most part, I'm not usually working with sensitive data in my day-to-day stuff. So something to keep in mind there, that we want to make sure there's that segmentation or isolation of these privileged accounts. Another safeguard is establishing and maintaining an inventory of service accounts. So again, keeping in mind that you may bring in third parties to do different work, etc. These are all accounts that need to be managed. These are also related to applications. So you create service accounts in cloud environments. that can then be leveraged to run certain applications and manage the access for that. So again, all this stuff needs to be monitored, inventoried, and then reassessed continuously of saying, do we really need this? Is this account still valid? And then finally, this is complex, so you really can't do stuff without automation these days, right? So really, the final safeguard here is centralizing that account management using some kind of directory like Active Directory service or some kind of identity service, so like SailPoint, Okta. I mean, again, there's a number out there. This is not an endorsement of any organization, but just keeping in mind that you really want some kind of central location where you can manage all this. Otherwise, when you think of enterprise scale, it gets really cumbersome really quickly, especially in cloud environments. In Control 5, we talked about account management overall, kind of a holistic view of managing those user accounts. In Control 6, we're talking about access control management. So we're really talking about what access do the accounts actually have. Now, this helps ensure that users as well as applications only have access to the minimum data or services they need to function. So this is a concept we call the principle of least privilege, just making sure that the right people or systems or applications only have the minimum necessary to do their job. We don't want to give them extra access. Organizations should have a centralized management system and also processes for provisioning, so giving the access, as well as deprovisioning that access, so taking it away. One common area you see issues with is when organizations grant local admin rights to all end users. You'll see that a lot in different organizations. And what that means basically is if there's some type of malware attack. So let's say I'm Larry in accounting and I click a phishing email and it downloads malware on my end user device, it can have a greater impact. It can allow the attacker to do more things if we've kind of given Larry the keys to the kingdom on that particular host. There's different types of There are different types of access control you might hear of. So you might hear things like role-based access control or RBAC. You may hear attribute-based access control or ABAC. You might hear policy-based access control or PBAC. We love acronyms in the cybersecurity world, by the way. So these can give you different levels of granularity. So as an example, role-based access control, as the name implies, what's your role in the organization? Are you in accounting? Are you in HR? Are you on the legal team? And that's kind of an older way of doing access control where based on that role, we grant you a set of privileges. Now, the challenge with that is you may need access to other systems. So then we have to do a bunch of one-offs and say, well, you need access to this and that. And well, maybe you don't need access to these other things. But with role-based, we're kind of limited. Like, well, you got the role, here you go. With attribute-based, that's based on different attributes where we can get a little more granular. And then, for example, it could be that if you don't log in from a certain geolocation, so let's just say, for example, you're in the United States, you live in Florida, and you're always logged in from Florida. Like you don't log in from anywhere else. But all of a sudden, we set that to where, okay, we know you're in Florida. That's where you're logging in from. You don't travel or anything like that for the company. We know you're logging in from Florida. But all of a sudden, there's a login from Vietnam. So that's a place where if we have attribute-based access control, we can say, wait a minute, that doesn't match the geolocation we've allowed for this user account. Let's block, let's send an alert about that access attempt so we can take a closer look. And then policy-based is where we can set different policies. As an example, using Active Directory, you can set GPOs or group policy objects. You can set those group policies to allow for certain things. So you can get very granular on the access, and you can do that both for assets, so your different systems. You can also do it for applications as well. So there's also a concept called zero trust where we continuously reassess to make sure that this thing, whether it's an application or device or user account, that it's continuously authenticating itself, improving like, hey, I'm me, give me the access. So we're not going to dive into zero trust as part of the CIS controls, but just understand that these days we can get pretty granular on the access. So a key takeaway for this sixth control here is just remembering to implement the principle of least privilege and ensure that you are doing proper management of privileged accounts. So we call it privileged account management, or PAM for short. This can significantly, so doing these couple of things can significantly reduce the attack surface area, and it can also help limit the impact of a successful attack. Safeguards for control number 6 include establishing an access granting process, also an access revoking process. We talked about that, provisioning, deprovisioning, and making sure that we do that with centralized management so we don't have to manually go in and try to do all that. Another safeguard is requiring multi-factor authentication for any externally exposed applications. A lot of places do this via SSO and then also have the MFA in place. Requiring that MFA for any remote network access as well as administrative access. So again, just putting another security control in place, another layer of security, right? Defense in depth is the terminology we would use there. So just adding another layer of security to try to protect our house against the robbers. Another safeguard is establishing and maintaining an inventory of authentication authorization system, so making sure we know what is actually granting that access. Centralizing that access control, and then finally defining and maintaining. In CIS controls, it says role-based access control, but just understand that there's different types of access control, and we can get very, very granular. CIS control number 7 is continuous vulnerability management. So organizations need to develop a plan to continuously assess and track the vulnerabilities of their enterprise assets as well as applications, and work to identify, prioritize, and also remediate those vulnerabilities. Now, remediation could be putting additional security controls in place to try to mitigate or reduce the risk from that vulnerability. It could include patching. Could also include, depending on the organization's risk appetite, could include them just accepting the risk of that particular vulnerability. The organizations also need to continuously monitor threat feeds. And this is both for new vulnerabilities that are being exploited in the wild, as well as any new threats that might be emerging that are going to be targeting the organization or targeting organizations in a similar industry. There's many tools that organizations can use for vulnerability management. Many of these tools map to things like the CVE, so Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, the Common Configuration and Enumeration, or CCE, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, the Open Vulnerability and Assessment Language, or OVAL as we call it, and or they may also map to the Extensible Configuration Checklist description format, which is abbreviated as XCCDF. Now, many organizations also take those tools and connect them to their ticketing systems. So that way they can automatically, when there's a vulnerability discovered, create a ticket for that, and then they can track and report on their findings and if they're fixing the vulnerability or what they're doing to address that particular vulnerability that's been identified by the tool. In addition to just identifying the vulnerabilities, the organization needs to determine the likelihood of a threat actor exploiting the vulnerability and what the actual impact would be to the organization. The reason you also need to do this is because executive leadership, your senior leadership, they're going to be asking for this. They're going to be asking for reports to help them understand what is our risk and what are we doing to reduce that risk if possible. So just because a vulnerability comes out in the news and everyone's freaking out about it and getting all excited about it, it doesn't mean that you even use that software in your organization. So it doesn't mean that just because a CVE comes out that it's necessarily a huge risk to your organization. Again, that's why reviewing the vulnerabilities that are identified and then prioritizing those based on your organization, because I may have a company and we don't have good security controls in place. So maybe that's a huge deal when that CVE comes out. But maybe at your company, you have 3 or 4 controls in place. So even if that new vulnerability that's come out is exploited, there's 3 or 4 security controls in place to help mitigate the rest of the attack chain. So just something to keep in mind there, that just because a vulnerability comes out in the news or people on social media are freaking out about it, it doesn't mean that your organization is going to have the same impact. So again, you really need to identify, is this going to even be an impact to the organization? And if so, how much of an impact is that going to be? So the key takeaway here for control number 7 is just understanding that since threat actors are constantly probing enterprises for weaknesses, as an organization, you need to implement a lifecycle assessment of vulnerability management. So basically, it's a continuous process of assessing for vulnerabilities, prioritizing them, remediating, et cetera, and just continuing that cycle. And making sure that's automated as much as possible because, again, you have other things to do in your day. So vulnerability management could eat up a ton of your time. And the more you can automate things, the better off you're going to be. Now, safeguards for control number 7 here, establishing and maintaining the vulnerability management process. So again, what is that overall process? How is your organization handling those vulnerabilities? How are you reviewing and updating any documentation that's needed? Identifying also if there's significant changes in the enterprise. How is that impacting your current vulnerability management process, and do you need to make adjustments? Another safeguard is establishing and maintaining a remediation process. So yes, we identify vulnerabilities, but how are we remediating that risk? Now, that could be patching, that could be adding additional security controls, that could also be accepting a certain level of risk. It really depends on the organization. Performing automated operating system patch management, as well as automated application patch management. So again, as much as we can automate things, we want to. Now, it doesn't mean that just because a patch comes out from Microsoft, it doesn't mean we go throw that in production right away. As many people will tell you that are experienced, they'll let you know that, hey, let's test it first, because there's always going to be some issue when you throw a patch in production. Really as much, even if you test a whole lot, but you try to reduce the amount of issues that you see by throwing a patch into a test environment, checking it against the systems and applications you're using, and see what might be breaking because of that patch. Another safeguard is performing automated vulnerability scans of internal enterprise assets as well as externally exposed assets. So again, how can we automate this? There's so many tools out there. There's tools like Nessus Vulnerability Scanner, OpenVAS, or Greenbone. So there's so many tools out there that you can use for vulnerability scanning that will give you good automation as well as help you identify what vulnerabilities you may have. Now, keep in mind that if your organization's building software applications, you'll still want to have human element baked in there as well, because automated tools can only catch what's essentially in these databases, and you need a person to look at things oftentimes to really identify, is this a risk to the organization? And then again, finally, the additional safeguard there is remediating those detected vulnerabilities. So what are we doing to fix the issue or to reduce our risk, or are we accepting the risk? And if so, why? What does that really mean for the organization and our business operations? So CIS control number 8 has to do with audit log management. So proper log management and also auditing those logs, because it doesn't make any sense if we just collect stuff and never look at it. This can potentially help organizations detect future attacks, detect current attacks, as well as help the organization recover from an attack. Now, if an organization has a poor log analysis process, this means that attackers could actually remain undetected on compromised systems on your network for an extended period of time. Generally speaking, there's two main types of logs that are configured independently. You have your system logs and also your what's called your audit logs. System logs, as the name implies, those are going to provide those system level events. So they're going to be logging things like processes that were on a host that were started or stopped, system crashes, and any type of abnormalities around there. Audit logs, on the other hand, are going to include those user level events as well. So for example, if a user logs in, it's going to track and say, okay, Susan logged in at this time. It can also track failed login attempts. So, hey, we had 56 failed login attempts. We don't think that, Jim forgot his password that much and is coming from, let's just say, Vietnam, and Jim's based out of New York State. So things like that are tracking also when a user accesses or even modifies a file. That can help us identify, is maybe an insider threat going on? Maybe they're modifying data and corrupting it or destroying it or doing something else to the data in a file. Maybe they're stealing something. So logs are critical also for proper incident response. And these can help the enterprise understand the extent of an attack. So if you look at the logs, you say, oh, wow, it went through here, there, they did this, they did that. It can also show you information that was accessed, as well as information that might have been exfiltrated. So just because it was accessed doesn't mean they stole anything. So what was exfiltrated? Did they look at a lot of things and then they stole a little bit, or did they not get to that point because you stopped the attack as it was happening? And then also things like when and how the attack occurred. So getting that forensic data in the logs. So a key takeaway here for this control is just really understanding and keeping it ingrained in your head that proper log management helps these organizations detect and recover from attacks. Most organizations, especially larger ones, use centralized log management. There's a variety of tools out there for doing that. So basically all that does is it's going to ingest logs from various sources, put them all in the same readable format. And the various sources could be your IDS, so intrusion detection system, could be firewalls, could be different SIM tools you're using, could be coming from host systems, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of places you can get logs. And in fact, there's so many places to get logs and so much data, it becomes very cumbersome for organizations to actually make sense of everything. But a centralized log management system will pull all that information in, try to make sense of it, and then spit it out, so to speak, in a dashboard view that makes it easier for you as a security professional to try to identify what's abnormal here, what's going on, and so you can kind of drill down into those areas that you should care about. Now, you can also add things like scripting, write different custom scripts that will help seep through the data and really identify like what's abnormal to bring to your attention as the human. Now, safeguards for control number 8. Number 1, establishing and maintaining that audit log management process. Again, without the proper process, overarching process in place, your organization is not going to be collecting properly, you're not going to be reviewing logs properly, not going to retain the logs properly. The other thing around retention is understand that you have to also be mindful of storage costs, especially in cloud environments. So you'll see organizations, they may delete logs. You just can't keep everything forever. So you have to determine what's critical to keep and for how long. Another safeguard is collecting those audit logs. So again, just pulling that in from all different types of enterprise assets, ensuring the adequate audit log storage. So again, just how long are we going to store this stuff? Are we storing it properly? Are we encrypting that information so that the logs can't be altered? Like, how are we protecting those logs in case we need to go back for forensic analysis? Standardizing the time synchronization between logs. Again, a lot of this can be managed by that centralized logging system, right? So you don't have to go in and like manually do all this stuff. Collecting detailed audit logs, collecting both DNS query and URL request audit logs, connecting audit logs from the command line. So anything that's running, for example, if someone's running a PowerShell script or running a Bash script, if someone's using remote terminal access, so if someone's SSHing or something like that into stuff, or using RDP. So audit logging all that, right? We're just logging all of that and then taking a look at it. We already talked about a safeguard of centralized audit logs, so centralizing that audit log management, retaining the audit logs. Generally speaking, a minimum of 90 days. It depends on the logs. You may keep certain logs longer, and in your organization, you might keep them shorter. But generally, like a bare minimum is like keeping it for 90 days because those logs, you may find out 90 days from now you got breached. And now you need to go back to those logs and take a look at them. So if you deleted the logs, you got rid of them, then you can't go back, right? So generally speaking, they're kept for a period of time, and that allows for you as an organization to detect potential attacks and then come back to do the forensic analysis of those logs. The other part of that is compliance. So certain logs you may have to keep for a certain period of time depending on what your organization needs to be compliant with. And then the last couple of safeguards, conducting the audit log reviews as well as collecting service provider logs. So where possible, one caveat here is with cloud service providers, depending on the environment you're using, you may be limited on what you can log. And conversely, you may also be limited on your incident response process and what you can actually do. So just understand that there are some limitations when you're using public cloud providers on what you'll be able to do around logs as well as around your incident response process. CIS control number 9 covers email and web browser protection. So attackers often target what we call layer 8 or the human layer. As such, organizations need to improve protection and detection of threats from both email and web vectors, and that's because these are very common routes for attackers to manipulate, again, layer 8 or the human layer. Web browsers can be exploited through vulnerabilities of the actual browser itself, so you'll see every so often Google Chrome will push out updates. So the browser itself can be vulnerable, as well as third-party plugins. And if you've seen any of the attacks around WordPress websites, you notice that a lot of those attacks are related to the third-party plugins that people are using. So limiting the plugins that users can actually install themselves, as well as blocking automatic execution of certain types of content, this can help reduce the risk significantly for your users as they're browsing the web. And many organizations also use sandbox tools or sandbox equivalent tools. And what this means is that users will have a sandbox environment they're actually doing their day-to-day work in. So that way, if they do browse to a malicious website or something like that, it just executes in the sandbox. It hopefully doesn't skip out and go across the organization. So it's a very contained environment. Now, email can be exploited a number of ways. The most popular across the board is going to be phishing attacks, and specifically against businesses, business email compromise, where the attacker has an end goal of trying to get usually financial transactions, financial information, or a financial transaction to take place. Organizations to combat those phishing emails can leverage different tools like spam filtering tools and also tools that scan for malicious attachments. They can leverage those at the email gateway itself to help reduce that risk. Then also enforcing things like DMARC can help reduce spam and spoofing attacks as well as the overall phishing attacks. In addition to technical tools to combat phishing, of course, many people listening to this have probably already gone through some type of security awareness training. So training those users to identify phishing emails and to have an easy way for them to report potential phishing emails. Even if they're reporting a lot of emails that are not phishing, it's a lot of times better safe than sorry, because a lot of these phishing emails these days are pretty difficult to detect just by looking at them if they're a phishing email or not. So a key takeaway here for control number 9 is attackers often target the people in your organization. So don't just get wrapped up in all the technical stuff. And of course, we put technical controls in place to try to help a little bit, but often it's the people that are targeted. But you can implement those technical controls and you can overall help protect the end users and your critical data and systems a little bit better. Now, when we talk about safeguards for control number 9, first safeguard is ensuring that you're only using fully supported browsers and email clients. So making sure that you're constantly keeping that software up to date, only using the latest version of web browsers, especially things like Google Chrome that have a lot of vulnerabilities that are found because they're such a popular browser to use, as well as email clients, making sure that we keep the email clients up to date. Another safeguard, using DNS filtering services. So basically using that to block known malicious domains across all your enterprise assets. Maintaining and enforcing network-based URL filters. So again, these can be used to help protect against your end users connecting to potentially malicious websites or even just unapproved websites. So some organizations will block Google Docs, Google Drive, things like that, because they're using Microsoft Teams, for example. So they block anyone using Google for a number of reasons. It could be for a number of reasons. One of the big ones being that somebody may just try to upload to their personal Google Docs critical information from the company, right? So part of data loss prevention, just blocking those Google domains. So it could be done a number of ways, right? It could be category-based filtering, saying, hey, block the Google stuff. Could be reputation-based, based on certain URLs being known for malicious activity. Could be block lists that you're ingesting from a threat intel feed or something like that. So the URL filters can be implemented in a number of different ways. Another safeguard is restricting unnecessary or unauthorized browsers and email client extensions. So again, let's reduce our attack surface, right? Let's remove anything that we don't need. Let's block any types of plugins or add-ons or things that all these end users want to install to make their life easier. Let's limit that stuff. Let's block it. Let's make sure if we are allowing something that there's a legitimate business use and it's not just personal preference. Because if we allow everybody to have their own way in an organization, especially an enterprise, we'll never have any security because everybody's got a different way of doing things. So just understand that there's got to be a legit business need for that, and it needs to go through some type of a process before that's approved, right? So it needs signed off, not by you, unless you're an executive. It needs signed off by some executive or the executive team so they can take ultimate ownership if something goes awry there. Another safeguard is implementing DMARC. So again, this helps really lower the chance of someone successfully spoofing an email. So somebody can't, they can still do it, but they can't easily spoof an email from me and say it's from me. So again, it really helps protect against spoofing and protects you to basically ensure that you know it's coming from a valid domain that's got DMARC in place. And then also using things like SPF, which is Sender Policy Framework, as well as DKIM, which stands for Domain Keys Identified Mail Standards. So just implementing DMARC, SPF, DKIM, that'll reduce a lot of the spoofing attacks you might see out there. And then the last couple of safeguards are blocking unnecessary file types. So with this one, try to get an idea of what types of files are used across the organization and then block everything else, every other type of file. One good way to do this in a smaller organization is like block everything you think people don't need, and then somebody will call you and say, hey, I need to be able to do this or that, right? So you'll quickly know what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing as far as what's allowed, what isn't allowed on the file types. And then finally, deploying and maintaining an email server that has anti-malware protection in place. So again, something that will scan those attachments for malware, or something that will sandbox things. There are some tools out there that will take any files that come into the company, strip out everything, and reassemble the file with the data with just the known good parts. So essentially, if there's anything malicious in there, it's stripping that out, and it's only giving you the good file with the good data in it. So in this last section of the course, we're going to cover the last half of the CIS Critical Security Controls. So we'll talk about malware defense, data recovery, network infrastructure management, network monitoring, security awareness and training, as well as service provider management, AppSec, incident response, and we'll wrap up with penetration testing. CIS control number 10 is around malware defenses. So malware can have many purposes, including capturing login credentials in the case of like a keylogger, stealing data, encrypting the data in the case of something like ransomware, or even destroying data in the case of a wiper. It can enter organizations through a variety of methods, including things like email attachments, so different files, Word docs, PDFs, etc., through links in emails, through web pages, through mobile devices, through removable media like your USB drives, end user devices, through cloud services, through third parties, etc., etc. There's a lot of different ways that malicious software can make its way into the organization. And over the past several years, these quote-unquote as-a-service offerings, like ransomware as a service, these have really popped up and gained traction on underground marketplaces, which significantly reduce the technical skills that are needed to conduct malware attacks. In fact, if your grandma's non-technical like mine, she could actually go purchase one of these on a license and deploy malware across the world. Organizations work to control the installation, spread, and execution of malicious code on their enterprise assets, and they do this through a variety of methods, including using things like EDR solutions, which are endpoint detection and response solutions, using traditional anti-malware solutions, so for example, using something like Bitdefender or Malwarebytes, implementing a proper vulnerability management program, so identifying those weaknesses in software applications, making sure those are updated or additional controls are put in place, so that way if an attack does happen, there's protections built in place. Analyzing log data to identify attacks, and then also building what we talked about in a previous video around detection engineering. So the example we gave before was Larry in accounting trying to run a PowerShell script all of a sudden on his system when Larry doesn't normally run those, or he doesn't need to run a PowerShell script. So if we build proper detection engineering, even if an attacker is trying to do what's called live off the land and use native services, for example, running a PowerShell script, we're able to say, wait a minute, for that particular host system, it doesn't make any sense for it to run a PowerShell script. Or we only allow certain PowerShell scripts to run that we've written. So if it's some other type of PowerShell script, it's not going to run properly. It's going to block it, alert us, and we'll be able to assess that system. So again, that's detection engineering, where we know what's supposed to happen, and we know how an attacker would have to attack that particular host or system. And from there, we build detection around that to then alert us to anything that's abnormal. So again, Larry in accounting doesn't normally run PowerShell scripts. All of a sudden, a PowerShell script tries to run in a system. We detect that, we send an alert, and we isolate that system, and we go investigate, did something actually occur? Or maybe Larry just decided to take a weekend class on PowerShell and he's playing around in his system. So key takeaway here is, again, malware these days is so easily attainable by non-technical users, or as I like to call them, script kiddies, from these underground marketplaces as well as above ground. People are selling stuff across social media as well. Organizations really need to have a multi-tiered approach. It's not just, oh, we've got anti-malware solution, we're good to go. It takes a multi-tiered or multi-layered approach to combating these malware attacks. Now, safeguards for control number 10 include deploying and maintaining an anti-malware software. So again, this could be any number of solutions out there, including some native tools like on Windows OS. You do have some ransomware protection built in natively. Configuring automatic anti-malware signature updates. Now, there's one caveat here. Of course, CIS is listing it, but just understand that most malware these days, the signature, it's going to be polymorphic. What does that mean? That means that it's constantly changing the signature as it infects different systems across your network, across other companies' networks. So just keep in mind that, yes, you should be taking that low-hanging fruit, which is building and maintaining an updated database of anti-malware signatures, but also keep in mind that things change frequently with malware these days. So that's not as an effective solution as it was several years ago. Another safeguard is disabling auto-run or autoplay features for removable media. So for example, if I plug in a USB stick in your system, it's not going to automatically execute whatever's on that. Another safeguard is enabling anti-exploitation features. So there are some different features. For example, Windows Defender has Exploit Guard. Microsoft also has Data Execution Prevention, or DEP as they call it. Apple has SIP, which is System Integrity Protection. So essentially, if there's any anti-exploitation features available natively on the system or on the application, go ahead and enable those. Another safeguard is just centrally managing that anti-malware software so you can identify what's going on with all your end-user systems, and then using behavior-based or heuristic-based anti-malware software or solutions. And again, a lot of these solutions these days have all this stuff just packaged up into one. So you don't have to go out and find individual applications for each one of these things. CIS Control 11 is data recovery. So if you recall from the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the availability of data is oftentimes more critical than confidentiality. An example of this would be make sure we have the availability and accuracy of weather information. If we own a trucking company, we have to make sure our trucks are able to get through to deliver whatever the products are that are on them. In addition to direct impacts on data, configuration changes can occur that lead to a system the data is being housed on to becoming insecure. So this can include things like adding or changing registry entries in Windows, turning off host security services, deleting log files, and opening unnecessary ports. And one key thing to remember here is just because these configuration changes are happening, it doesn't mean it's done maliciously. It's also accidental human error that leads to some of these security issues. So that's why having proper backups allows the organization to return the system to a known, trusted state and reduce the security risk to the data. Also, in the event of a ransomware attack, organizations need to have proper immutable backups. Basically, immutable just means that they can't be changed or altered for a period of time. And this way the organization can use those backups to restore to continue their business operations. If you recall back in CIS Control 3, which was data protection, you learned that organizations need to have a proper data management process. The organization's procedures for data recovery are a part of that data management process. Now, data recovery procedures should specify how and where the data is being backed up, and as well as the frequency and type of data backups. So for example, incremental backups, or are we doing full backups? And this is going to be based on the value of the data, the sensitivity of that data, as well as any retention requirements of that data. And one key thing to keep in mind here is that backups should be periodically tested to ensure that everything is intact and functional. So key takeaway for control number 11 here is the availability of data can be very critical to the organization's operations. And with today's threats, such as ransomware, it's critical for organizations to have proper backups that are protected against alteration. So safeguards for control number 11 include establishing and maintaining that data recovery process. So again, addressing what are we going to do, where's the data backed up at, how often are we backing up, what types of backups are these, and how are we going to then restore from those data backups, and how long will that take? Because we need to know, based on the type of data, how long this is going to actually take us. Another key safeguard here is performing automated backups. So again, making sure those backups are run on a scheduled basis. Could be weekly, could be nightly backups. Usually incremental backups are going to be done it could be every 24 hours, could be every 12 hours. It really depends on the criticality of that data. And then other data that's not so sensitive or critical, those backups might be a weekly backup or even a monthly backup or something like that. Another safeguard is protecting the recovery data. So again, making sure that we are segmenting data, making sure that we're encrypting that data, making sure we have those immutable backups so that way if ransomware does attack, it doesn't attack our backups as well. We can keep those protected. And preferably we have backups that are disconnected in some capacity or are heavily segmented from our network. So if we run into issues, we do have data that's still protected out there that we can leverage for our backups and recovery. And then another safeguard is establishing and maintaining isolated instances of the recovery data, which I mentioned, as well as testing that data recovery. So again, what's the point in backing up data if when we restore from those backups, it doesn't work? So that's why it's important to do that continuous testing of, is everything still intact on this data that we've been backing up? And is it still functional? Like, is this actually data we can use? Or if not, what's going on? What's wrong? And then we need to make adjustments from there. CIS control number 12 is network infrastructure management. So securing network infrastructure is a critical part of an organization's layered defense or defense in depth. Organizations should ensure that they are implementing, configuring, and also tracking any network devices to help protect against the exploitation of those devices by different threat actors or attackers. Network infrastructure includes things like firewalls, routers, switches, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, or IDS, IPS, wireless access points, physical and virtualized gateways, etc., etc. So a lot of different types of devices we may have on our network infrastructure these days. However, we have default configurations. Just like we've talked about in previous security controls, default configurations for the devices are set with that ease of use and also ease of deployment in mind, and not necessarily security. So again, as we talked about in previous controls, there's default vulnerabilities on the devices that include using those default credentials. So for example, on a Cisco router, it might be Cisco or admin for the username and password. Having unnecessary ports or services open, supporting older protocols, or having those even be the main thing that are being used by the device. So older protocols that are very vulnerable to attack, as well as having what we called the bloatware earlier, right? These unnecessary applications that might be installed on the device. Attackers take those vulnerabilities, leverage those to gain network access, leverage those to redirect our network traffic to areas they control, and or sniffing the network traffic to try to intercept sensitive data from us. Since network security constantly is changing, though, these days, organizations really need to ensure that their network infrastructure is documented and that the network diagrams they have are current, which is a big challenge. It sounds easy, but it's actually a really big challenge for a lot of organizations out there. It's very critical for organizations to monitor for any unsupported software on their network devices, as well as perform proper account management and access control. Make sure, again, the right people, the right systems, the right applications can access the right things, but have only those things that they should have access to, right? So again, implementing things like the principle of least privilege. So a big takeaway, or the main key takeaway from control number 12 here, is just understanding that default configurations can increase security risk across the organization. So it's absolutely critical that organizations have a plan in place and a process in place to address those default configurations across the organization to help reduce the overall attack surface area. Now, safeguards for control number 12, the network infrastructure management, include ensuring the network infrastructure is up to date. We talked about that with the network diagrams and network mapping. There's several network as a service or NAS offerings, and if you're kind of brand new to IT and cybersecurity stuff, you'll see all sorts of as a service offerings these days. It almost seems like everything we're doing nowadays is as a service, or at least has an as a service offering. Establishing and maintaining that secure network architecture. So again, that's part of that is addressing the default configurations, but also segmenting, right? Using things like least privilege, setting limitations on availability, who's able to get access to what. Another safeguard is securely managing the network infrastructure, as well as establishing and maintaining the architecture diagram. So when we're talking about securely managing the network infrastructure, using secure network protocols like SSH, or HTTPS for our web traffic instead of using HTTP. So some very fundamental things that sometimes we take for granted and we may not necessarily implement across the board. So things that we want to do there. And then centralizing the authentication, authorization, and auditing, or as we call it, AAA. So centralizing the AAA of the network, using secure network management and communication protocols. So for example, using WPA2 or 3, and using different other secure protocols for our network communication. Ensuring remote devices utilize a VPN or something equivalent and are connecting to the enterprise's AAA infrastructure. So again, just making sure that our remote access users, people logging in from home, etc., are actually securely accessing our systems and making sure that nobody else can access those systems. And then finally, establishing and maintaining dedicated computing resources for all of our administrative work. So any type of admin work you're doing, it really should be segmented physically and logically, hopefully, as well as making sure that you segment access. So maybe 2 people have to log into something to be able to do a certain task, and then keeping that completely separate from somebody's standard access that they're using for their day-to-day task. And then also, if possible, or wherever possible, try to make sure that any administrative work that you're doing those systems, that network you're working on is not allowed internet access. That will help reduce the risk quite a bit. CIS Control 13 is network monitoring and defense. So as adversaries continue to evolve and share information amongst their peers about exploits, about ways to bypass different security controls, organizations need to implement processes and security tools to help protect against them. However, security tools themselves are only effective if they're part of a continuous monitoring that includes also a human element to help detect, analyze, and respond to threats. By leveraging a good security operations capability, organizations can identify tactics, techniques, and procedures, or commonly called TTPs, of these attackers. It can help them proactively hunt threats and also build better detection and response capabilities. It's critical for organizations to understand the critical business functions they have, critical data and the data flow, network and server architectures, end user devices, accounts, and any third-party connections that they may have, especially in cloud environments, because this helps the organization gain visibility into their architecture so they can then implement appropriate administrative as well as technical security controls, and also ensure that there's proper logging, proper monitoring, as well as proper incident response procedures. So a key takeaway for security control number 13, network monitoring and defense, is the security of an organization is a continuous process. And if you rely too much just on technology, it can actually help threat actors remain undetected for months, years, or even you never detect them. So building an effective operational capability that includes threat intelligence, threat hunting, and detection engineering can help protect the organization. When we talk about safeguards for Control 13, first one is centralizing security event alerting. So for example, using a SIM tool and centralizing a dashboard to be able to ingest that information and identify what are we seeing, what might be going on. Also deploying both host-based intrusion detection solutions as well as network-based intrusion detection solutions, and also deploying intrusion prevention solutions for both of those. And a lot of times they're combined, right? So you'll have an IDS, IPS solution. Performing traffic filtering between network segments if appropriate, so monitoring that traffic internally between different segments of our network. Managing access control for remote assets, so making sure that these are people or applications or systems that should be accessing things and that it has not been compromised. Collecting network traffic flow logs. So again, just collecting all that traffic flowing throughout our network and network devices, aggregating that, and then being able to make sense of that information. Deploying port level access control. So essentially using things like certificates to help prove authentication a little better. Performing application layer filtering. So using things like proxies or gateways, as well as tuning our security event alerting thresholds. Because just because right now you have what looks like normal network traffic doesn't mean that you're not going to recognize new threats or there's not going to be an incident or something like that then leads you to making some adjustments. So again, going back to continuous, right? This is a continuous process. You're constantly updating. You're constantly making configuration changes. You're constantly assessing logs. You're constantly pulling in threat intel feeds and analyzing those. And depending on the size of the organization, you may have separate teams doing all of these things and coming together, or you and your small team might be responsible at smaller organizations for kind of doing all these, wearing all these different hats, so to speak. CIS Control 14 is security awareness and skills training. So people play a critical part in the success of the enterprise's security program. We talked about layer 8 or the human layer earlier in the program. It's often easier for attackers to encourage a user to actually just click a link in an email or open some attachment in the email to install malware onto their system than it is for the attacker to directly try to exploit the network and install the malware that way. As such, organizations need to provide regular security awareness training to their teams. Now, security awareness training shouldn't just be a once-in-the-year video training, because realistically, new types of phishing attacks are developed every single day. And organizations can leverage current events. So, for example, if there's a recent data breach in the news or some other type of security situation in the news, they can leverage that to then show employees in a simple email or text or whatever communication stream, Slack message, etc. They can show them how their day-to-day actions could directly impact the organization by leveraging that current event. And the security awareness training should really be adapted to the enterprise's regulatory requirements as well as their threat postures. So basically, looking at what are we required to do, what kind of compliance, et cetera, are we required to do as an organization, for example, if we're in financial services or if we're in healthcare. And then also recognizing that what are those threats that are most likely to impact the organization, because not everything out there is going to be targeted towards our organization. So a key takeaway here for control number 14 is just, again, keeping in mind that security awareness training is not a one-time activity. It's a continuous thing. And organizations really need to adapt that training that they get. A lot of them are out-of-the-box training, so they need to adapt that to their particular organization's needs. So safeguards for control number 14. Number 1, establishing and maintaining that security awareness program. Also, training workforce members to recognize those social engineering attacks. And sometimes it's very difficult to recognize a phishing email these days. So oftentimes we want to encourage our teams to just report it if they feel it's something doesn't seem right about that particular message, email, text message, whatever. Have them report that, and then we can provide additional training from there. Training the workforce members on authentication best practices. So using things like multi-factor authentication, making sure if we are using passwords that they are strong and complex, as well as not reusing credentials, right? So not reusing the same password for every single system. And again, a lot of organizations are using single sign-on these days, so you don't see quite as many issues with that. Training the workforce on data handling best practices. So understanding what are they supposed to do? So what am I supposed to do if I work in accounting or if I'm the janitor or something? Like, what are my responsibilities around properly storing the data, properly transferring data, so sending it to somebody else or sending it to a certain system, archiving that data if I'm responsible for destroying the data in some way. So as an example, in healthcare, if I have a physical patient chart and I look at something, at some point I may need to destroy a document. So if it's not part of their actual record, let's just say I printed something so it was easier for me to see versus looking at their online chart, then I want to take that document if I no longer need it and actually go through the process of destroying it. Typically just a shredder that is secured. So also training workforce members on causes of unintentional data exposure. So again, understanding that it's not always a malicious intent behind this, that sometimes they may accidentally send something to the wrong place, and understanding what happens in that situation. Training the workforce members to recognize and report security incidents. So again, going back to phishing emails as an example, having them recognize that, hey, something is amiss here, something doesn't look right, and having them report on that so somebody that's a little better trained in security can take a closer look. Training them how to identify and report if their enterprise assets are missing any security updates. So for example, if they got a laptop and that's out-of-date software, how do they report that? In most cases, that stuff's automated, but maybe they've been offline for a while and on vacation or something, or let's just say paternity or maternity leave. And so now they need to make sure that their items are up to date. So how do they report that to you to say, hey, this looks like it's out of date. It's telling me I need to update something. Training the workforce on dangers of connecting to and also transmitting data over insecure networks. So a big one here is airports, right? Public Wi-Fi at hotels. So just communicating why they need to use the standard security measures that the organization has in place. So for example, simple one being a VPN. So why should you connect to the VPN first before you're trying to transmit any of the sensitive data? And then also conducting role-specific security awareness training, because yes, we can all go through general training, but if I'm an accountant, if I'm the janitor, if I'm the CEO, my responsibilities and the data I'm going to be working with are totally different usually, right? So I need to know what's relevant to me. So that's where we have additional security awareness trainings in addition to the standard stuff we put out for everybody at the org. So that way I can say, okay, this applies to me. I now understand why I need to do these particular things. CIS Control 15 is service provider management. So as we had seen with the SolarWinds supply chain attack and the more recent attack on Tectivity, which affected Uber and Uber Eats data, there is a significant risk of compromise from third parties. Organizations need to develop processes for evaluating third-party service providers that are holding sensitive data and or that are responsible for the enterprise's critical IT platforms to ensure that those third parties are meeting a bare minimum level of best practices for security. In addition, many data security and privacy regulations require their protection to extend to those third parties. So as an example, the business associate agreements under HIPAA. While there's not a standard quote-unquote checklist for assessing third-party risk across all industries, Many enterprises are leveraging things like ISO 27001 as well as the CIS controls to help ensure third parties are meeting that bare minimum baseline of security. Organizations should have a policy regarding the review of third-party service providers, along with maintaining an inventory of other providers, and also associating a risk rating with each one that addresses the potential impact of the business in the event of an incident. A key takeaway for control number 15 here is just reiterating that third-party providers represent a significant risk to the enterprise, especially the smaller providers, as many of them do not have a mature security posture. And organizations need to ensure that they are fully assessing the risk of these entities and identifying any compliance requirements for those third parties. So safeguards for Control 15 include establishing and maintaining that inventory of service providers. So again, classifying these providers, like why are we using them? What area are they in? What industry? What's the purpose of them? What do they have access to? Establishing and maintaining a service provider management policy. So how are we monitoring these providers? How are we, if we get rid of this service provider, how are we decommissioning them? And then reviewing that policy consistently. Classifying the service providers, again, making sure that we identify what kind of data are they accessing or do they have access to? What's the sensitivity of the data? What's the volume of that data? What are availability requirements? So are they a cloud service provider and they have to meet certain minimum requirements for us on availability of the data? So these are things we need to keep in mind, along with applicable regulations, as we talked about, for example, with HIPAA and the business associate agreements, any inherent risk that based on the type of provider they are, that it will automatically introduce some type of risk to us, as well as is there any risk that we are aware of that we've mitigated in some capacity? Another safeguard is ensuring the service provider contracts include security requirements. You'll see this a lot in the financial services industry where, for example, let's say you're a financial company that has a financial software that banks use. If you don't carry cyber insurance in many cases, that's in the contract. And so if you don't carry insurance or if you lose your policy for some reason, you're now in violation of your contracts with all those banks. So something to keep in mind based on your industry, that this can become very expensive for an organization and even potentially put an organization out of business if they're not maintaining proper security. Another safeguard is assessing the service provider. So again, going back into that continuous assessment and then looking at different industry assessments. So for example, SOC 2 compliance or PCI DSS compliance, the attestation of compliance, or AOC as we call it, using things like customized questionnaires, etc. So all different ways to assess these different service providers. Many of them, especially in the cloud space, will automatically go through different audits. So for example, a SOC 2 audit. So that way they can just provide that to clients instead of having to keep allowing clients to assess them over a period of time. Another safeguard, monitoring those service providers. Again, monitoring what are they getting access to, what kind of data, as well as in your threat intelligence feeds, monitoring to see if those service providers are having some issue, right? If there's chatter on the dark web about those particular service providers being breached or something like that. So your threat intelligence that you're gathering for your company should also include monitoring those third-party providers. And then finally, the final safeguard here is just securely decommissioning those service providers. Again, once we're not using them anymore, how are we deactivating those accounts? Whether it's user accounts or we set up a service account for them. How are we terminating any data flows, so any APIs we might have set up? And also, how are we ensuring that we're making sure they are securely disposing of any data that might be within their system still as we are decommissioning them? CIS Control 16 is application software security. We interact with applications in our day-to-day tasks, from apps on your mobile device to work applications. Enterprises also use applications to manage sensitive data and manage access control to systems and other resources. If attackers can compromise these applications, it can often allow them to remain undetected in their attacks and bypass security controls and sensors you might have in place. If attackers are unable to compromise application credentials, the next best attack vector is usually weaknesses in the applications themselves. The modern application development environment is highly complex, diverse, and dynamic. Applications are running on multiple platforms, including the cloud, mobile, and web. Software development lifecycles have also become shorter and more agile, and applications are often assembled from a mix of development frameworks and code libraries. All of these moving pieces significantly increase the attack surface area of these applications. Vulnerabilities in applications can exist for many reasons, including insecure design, insecure infrastructure, mistakes in coding, weak authentication, and a lack of proper testing for unexpected conditions. Attackers can exploit specific vulnerabilities like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, and buffer overflows to get access to an organization's sensitive data or to take control over their critical assets to leverage them as pivot points for additional attacks. These pivots could include harvesting user credentials, harvesting data, or installing malware on the systems. So what can organizations do to help protect their applications? Implementing security into the entire DevOps process, or as we call DevSecOps, can help organizations produce more securely designed applications. Continued testing of applications to identify weaknesses and leveraging automation wherever possible can help organizations maintain a secure and agile development pipeline. Organizations can also leverage zero trust initiatives both on the corporate network and by using microsegmentation with the applications themselves to continuously assess access control. And there are a number of resources available to help enterprises, including the SafeCode Application Security Addendum, the NIST Secure Software Development Framework, or SSDF, the Software Alliance, the OWASP, and also the Cloud Security Alliance. Key takeaways here for control number 16 are that today's complexity and speed of application development significantly increase the attack surface area of the applications. And this requires organizations to leverage a multi-layered approach to both building more secure applications and implementing network and host security controls to help better protect access to the applications, especially those that are housing sensitive and or critical data and services. So there are a number of safeguards for security control number 16, and we'll run through those. So first one is establishing and maintaining a secure application development process. So again, making sure that we're checking the security of third-party code that we're using, making sure we're using best practices around secure coding, making sure we're training developers in security, so not just having them in the mindset of a developer, making sure we have proper testing procedures for applications as well as proper documentation. Establishing and maintaining a process to accept and address software vulnerabilities. So as we are identifying vulnerabilities through manual testing as well as automated testing, what are we doing with those? Do we have a process in place to actually make sure we're addressing those vulnerabilities in the code? And keeping in mind that just like you would see with Microsoft Windows, there's constantly new vulnerabilities no matter what stage of releasing that code you're at. So there's always going to be vulnerabilities that are discovered, and so you really need to have a process in place to address those. Performing root cause analysis on security vulnerabilities, so really identifying what's actually causing this, and is it something that we can fix in the code, or is it something that we have to make a recommendation of saying, hey, look, because of the way this code functions, there's not really anything we can do to fix it at the code level. So here's what we recommend on additional security controls to put in place to help mitigate this issue. Establishing and managing an inventory of third-party software components. So using things such as what we call the software bill of materials, or SBOM. You'll see that out there in the industry a lot, used as terminology. So just making sure that we have an inventory of whatever third-party components we're using, and that we're keeping that up to date to know exactly what's in our code and if there's vulnerability in any of these libraries that we might be using. Using up-to-date and trusted third-party software components. So again, just making sure that we've got proper frameworks and libraries that are essentially trusted and up to date, because again, a lot of these libraries might be out of date by several years, and that leads to additional vulnerabilities in our applications. Establishing and maintaining a severity rating system and also process for application vulnerabilities. So again, just because we discover vulnerabilities doesn't mean it's something we have to go fix right away. Maybe that vulnerability isn't something that leads to what we call remote code execution, where the attacker can execute basically administrative level code on the system. So if it's not a significant vulnerability, we need to have a process in place, a rating system in place for that. And so for example, the CVSS, or Common Vulnerability Scoring System, and the CVEs that you see out there, if you're totally new to this tech stuff, these are things that are rating systems, right? So they allow us to say, hey, this is a very severe thing. We also internally as an organization need to have our own rating system. So just because a CVE comes out and it's rated as a 9 out of 10, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily something that's critical for us to fix right away. Using standard hardening configuration templates for our application infrastructure. So for example, our platform as a service components, when we're talking about cloud environments, or SaaS, or software as a service components. Also not allowing in-house software that's developed to actually weaken our configuration hardening. So making sure that our code is not weakening anything, making sure that things we're using are not essentially going against the grain from those standard, like industry recommended hardening standards out there. Separating our production and non-production systems, so making sure that we have a test environment set up. So if we're testing code, making sure that that's not directly connected to our production environment, and if it is, that we've got layers and layers of security controls. Because one of the key vectors that attackers and I myself have used before is getting in through the test environment, compromising software developer credentials, and then leveraging that to pivot over to the production system. So a key aspect there is making sure that you got segmentation like crazy, and also making sure that you're using a test environment to test the code in as realistic environment as possible to see if you can break anything, so that way you can fix the code before you actually roll it out to production. You'll never get 100% on that. There's always some issue you'll find. Some end user will do something in production that you're not expecting, but if you can, the more you can reduce that, the better off you're going to be. Training developers in application security concepts and secure coding. So making sure that software developers, right, most of these programs out there don't actually include secure software development or secure coding in their programs. They just say, hey, here's how to build an application, have fun. So security is kind of an afterthought, and traditionally it's been an afterthought. So making sure that you train your developers in secure coding best practice, so they know as they're writing the code that they can test the code properly, they can implement security. And really, you want the developers to be the front line of security for these applications. You don't want them to have to run to an analyst or someone every single time to help them fix the code. You want these developers to be empowered to try to fix your own code and make it more secure out of the gate. Applying secure design principles in the application architecture. So again, just making sure that you're using proper design and building for security as opposed to bolting on security after the fact. Leveraging vetted modules or services for application security components. So again, making sure that if you're using any additional code out there, that you're making sure you put things in proper security components in place. Also, using things that are kind of best practices in industry, right? Around identity access management, around encryption, around auditing, around logging, etc. Implementing code level security checks. So using things such as static analysis and dynamic analysis to basically, throughout the life cycle of the code that you're building, to verify that secure coding practices are actually being followed. Just because we tell people to do it doesn't mean they're actually going to do it. Conducting application penetration testing, so just testing those apps throughout the life cycle of the apps to make sure that we're finding any vulnerabilities and trying to fix those as best as possible. And doing that both as an authenticated user, so pretending that we're someone inside the organization using the application, and also pretending that we're someone outside the organization that's trying to get in. So testing continuously in both those mindsets. And then, of course, conducting threat modeling. This helps us identify and address any types of design flaws in the security before the code's actually created. So that's why it's important to follow this entire process here as we're kind of sketching out what the application is going to look like. That's why we need to start security at the beginning to really design things properly and design for security throughout, right out of the gate. CIS Controls 17 is incident response management. So why is incident response management so critical? Well, a comprehensive cybersecurity program includes protection, detection, response, and recovery capabilities. And the primary goal of incident response is to identify threats to the enterprise, respond to them before they can spread, and remediate them before they can cause harm. In addition, a proper incident response program can help organizations build better detection engineering to help protect against these threats in the future. As an example, let's say that we know Larry in accounting normally doesn't run PowerShell scripts. So we design detection engineering based on some past incidents of malware attacks that say, hey, if a PowerShell script's going to run on these certain systems, these certain end user systems, it's more likely to be an incident, a ransomware attack, versus it being a legitimate use. So we build detection engineering that says, hey, that doesn't look right. It immediately isolates Larry in accounting's computer, sends us an alert so we can call Larry and say, hey, what's going on? And then he may tell us, hey, I'm at lunch. I don't know what's going on with my computer. So we know it's likely an attacker on there. Or he may say, yeah, I was learning PowerShell over the weekend. I took a course. I wanted to learn it. So I tried to run a script on my computer, but it was blocked. And so we might investigate further to determine, was he trying to run a malicious script, or was it just something completely benign? In addition to the technical response of incident response, the incident response team will also need to communicate their findings to various stakeholders in the organization. Now, this is especially critical in the event of data compromise. So if you work in the response team in your organization, you should be provided guidance on what you can and cannot say during communication to stakeholders. Your communication on incidents helps senior leadership understand the impact of the incident and helps them understand how the incident may impact things like service level agreements or SLAs with customers or partners, might affect company revenue, how it might affect regulatory compliance, breach disclosure rules, or how it might affect the overall organization's mission. Now, there are many resources out there available for organizations around incident response best practices. One is the Council of Registered Security Testers, or CREST. They've got a cybersecurity incident response guide, and also NIST has NIST 800-161, which is a computer security incident handling guide, and that provides additional guidance for organizations in building out an effective incident response plan. So, just key takeaway here for Control 17, a proper incident response plan can help the organizations identify security threats to the organization's mission, as well as allow the security team to build more proactive defenses. And NIST 800-161 is an excellent resource for enterprises to use for building out their initial incident response plan and team. So security safeguards for control number 17 are designating personnel to manage the incident handling. So designating kind of that key person who's going to be the overarching person responsible for things, as well as a backup person in case that person leaves the company or they're out. And they're basically going to manage the enterprise's incident handling process. This might be like an incident response team lead. It could be a director of security, could be a manager of security. In some smaller organizations, it could also be like the CISO or VP of information security that's handling that type of role. But there's always somebody that's kind of the key person at the top of the food chain that's going to manage the incident handling process. And this individual, or if it's like a CISO at a larger company, there's mid-level management that's going to be responsible for really just coordinating the efforts of incident response, the documentation, recovery efforts, as well as, who's involved in the incident response, right? So it may not just be internal employees. It might not just be an internal incident response team. Oftentimes, there'd be like a third-party vendor, for example, like a Mandiant FireEye, that might come in as a third party, and they do an investigation as well to help the organization. Establishing and maintaining contact information for reporting security incidents, so knowing who you need to contact. This can include law enforcement. It could include those third-party vendors that are helping out with incident response. It could be government agencies that need to be aware depending on the organization that you're with. Could be additional stakeholders as well. So there might be a number of places you're contacting whenever there's an incident, and it can also vary based on the type of incident. So let's say there's a ransomware attack, maybe you got to contact certain people or certain organizations, as opposed to maybe an insider threat where there was no ransomware attack, just some data theft, and maybe there's a certain aspect certain organizations you need to contact in that event. So it can really vary based on the type of incident. Establishing and maintaining an enterprise process for reporting those incidents. So how do we do that? Oftentimes it's going to be automated, where we'll get alerts that something's going on. But what's that actual process? And we need to make sure that you're reviewing this at least on an annual basis, or when there's a significant incident or significant change in the organization. So for example, if you work at a company and it gets acquired by another organization, what changes in the incident response at that time? Establishing and maintaining an incident response process. So again, using things like NIST 800-161, just to make sure that you're effectively building out your incident response process. So addressing things like, what are the roles and responsibilities? So who's responsible for what, essentially? What are any compliance requirements that we have, especially around reporting the incident? What's our communication plan? And then again, reviewing that annually, reviewing that, at least on a consistent basis, and as well as if there's any changes across the organization. Assigning those key roles and responsibilities. So again, making sure that we've got people likely from like the legal team, the IT or information security teams, the public relations team, especially if it's a data breach, right? What are we going to say? How are we going to communicate that we've been breached, and what we're doing, to try to mitigate the issue moving forward. HR, especially if it's an insider threat type of issue. Bringing in our incident responders, who's on that team. And then, anything else, right? Some companies are large enough, they've got a separate forensic team. They've got, additional teams that are completely separate. So who do we need to come in the mix on the incident response process? defining mechanisms for communicating during the incident response, and what's our communication chain look like. And then again, all of these things, we're constantly reviewing them, at least on an annual basis, hopefully sooner, and especially if there's like a breach or a change in the organization itself. Conducting routine incident response exercises, because the best plan in the world doesn't mean anything if it doesn't work. So we need to make sure we're constantly testing different scenarios to try to make it where, number one, we have a faster response when things actually do occur, and also identify areas of weakness that we have to try to plug those gaps. Conduct post-incident reviews. So just essentially in the military, this is called an after-action report, or sometimes called a hot wash, depending on the unit you're with. But essentially just looking at like what happened during the incident, what did we do good, what should we improve, and what did we learn? And then also, as a side of that, also building out what's called security playbooks. So essentially we can put those in our SIM tools, or we can have, different playbooks, and these can be used in the event of an additional attack that follows, that's in a similar structure as the one we just went through. And then establishing and maintaining security incident thresholds. So really this allows your organization to determine, what's an incident and what's an event. For example, is there abnormal activity we're seeing? Is there security vulnerabilities being identified or weaknesses? Was there a data breach? Was there some type of a privacy incident? So for example, if you worked at a healthcare organization, did someone look at a patient record they shouldn't have? Let's just say maybe Beyonce was in the hospital, so a nurse looked at Beyonce's record that didn't actually work with the patient. So that's technically an issue, right, under HIPAA. So that's a breach of the privacy of that patient, because that person did not have a legitimate need to look at the patient chart. So again, just identifying what are these thresholds we have, who do we need to communicate these incidents or events to if certain things are happening, and then continuously reviewing this to make sure that we're still have a solid security structure in place for our incident response. So the last CIS control that you're going to learn about is CIS Control 18, which is penetration testing. So a successful defensive security posture requires you to assess your defenses as an attacker, and attackers are constantly working to identify new vulnerabilities as well as attack vectors. So organizations really need to have a way to test against these new methods. So penetration testing is often performed for a few reasons, including compliance reasons, testing defenses to ensure that they're operating correctly, so what we call verification of those defenses, testing to see if the right defenses have been used, or what we call validating the defenses, and testing if vulnerabilities that are discovered can actually be exploited by an attacker. So CIS Control 7 addressed vulnerability testing, where the enterprise checks for vulnerabilities. Penetration testing takes that a step further to actually exploit those vulnerabilities to see how far an attacker can actually go, and what business process or data might be impacted through exploitation of the vulnerability. Now, red teaming is another method to test defenses. A key difference between penetration testing, or what we call pen testing for short, and red teaming is that red teams simulate specific attack tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, to evaluate how the enterprise's environment will actually hold up to a real attack. Now, there's a few resources for organizations to get started with penetration testing. Some of these are the Penetration Testing Execution Standard, or PTES, the OWASP Penetration Testing Methodologies, as well as the PCI Security Standards Council Penetration Testing Guidance. So, key takeaways for Control 18, penetration testing is used to validate the organization has correct security controls in place and also verify that they are functioning correctly. And a key thing here is also, it's important to scope a penetration test correctly and properly define the rules of engagement. And remember, you always want to have the paperwork signed before beginning the engagement, because essentially that paperwork acts as your get out of jail free card if you are caught during a pen test by authorities. Safeguards for Control 18 include establishing and maintaining that penetration testing program. So making sure that you're properly identifying the size, the complexity of the program, the maturity of the enterprise, essentially looking at the scope. So for example, looking at what are we testing on the network, or what should be tested? What about our web applications? What about APIs? What about any hosted services? Any physical controls that we have in place? As well as when we're talking about cloud environments, what can you actually pen test? Because you're not allowed to essentially attack the availability or do denial of service attacks in many cloud service providers. So key things to keep in mind are what are you actually legally able to do or able to do under your SLAs with cloud providers. And then also as part of establishing that program, making sure you identify like how often are we going to do this, right? What's the frequency of the pen test? For example, a lot of places do it either annually or semi-annually as far as external pen tests. Any limitations? So are we pen testing during business hours, or are we only doing it after hours? And are there any specific like attack types that we're going to exclude so that way we don't cause any chaos in the business operations? Who's the point of contact? What are our processes for remediation? So if we throw on some backdoors, are we taking those off again? Are we taking those shells off again? Or what's the process there? So really identifying like what are we doing essentially as part of the program. Performing periodic external pen tests. So oftentimes for compliance reasons, this is at least annual. Depending on what industry you're in, it might also be a semi-annual thing. But typically there's some external company that needs to come in and actually test things, because otherwise it's just an organization saying, oh yeah, we're doing the right stuff. We got everything in place. And that's really not an effective security plan. Remediating any pen test findings. What you'll find if you ever go out and actually do pen testing is you're going to find that a lot of places you'll go do a pen test, and then 6 months or a year later, you're going to come back and you're going to find the exact same stuff. So if you're doing this for an organization, building out this process for the organization, making sure that you got some kind of policy in place of like, when are we remediating stuff so you can actually fix the issues that you're finding. Validating security measures. So after you do the pen test and you hopefully fix things, making sure that we're actually identifying, did we fix those controls and are they actually effective against the attack that we were doing? So validating that we got the appropriate security measures in place. Otherwise, what's the point of even doing a pen test? And then performing periodic internal penetration testing as well. At least annually, but oftentimes, depending on the size of the organization, this would be done at least semi-annually and sometimes a lot more frequently. Again, things like red teaming are going to be often done a lot more frequently, whereas a penetration test might be semi-annual at most places, might also be done like every 3 months or so, quarterly as well.